So if we look around the world, it's difficult to find a part where there isn't conflict and there isn't instability. In fact, we're blessed here in the UAE. We recently had Abu Dhabi named the safest city in the world, and Dubai came in at number 4. But with all that instability, how do we as individuals and human beings kind of survive that and yet indeed thrive in all of that? Well, today at the Emirates Literature Festival, I am delighted to be joined by a best-selling author who can perhaps guide us through that. Gelong Thubten, author of Handbook for Hard Times, A Monk's Guide to Fearless Living. Welcome to the Mental Space Podcast. It is a tricky time we're living in right now, isn't it? I mean, it feels like your insights and wisdom as a meditation teacher, as an author, are perhaps sorely needed in many parts of the world.
The interesting thing about this book is that I came up with the idea to write it in 2019 and started to write it, and then COVID happened.
Yeah.
And I got very badly hit by COVID myself, and I was sick for a couple of years. And I remember thinking that, oh, I should really get on with my book because the world is in turmoil now, and this book about hard times would be so, apt. But I was too sick to write. I did write bits of it, but I was too sick to finish it. And then I was able to finish it after some lockdown ended and my health improved. And there wasn't a sense that hard times are now over, where it's all fine now, because we moved from one struggle to the next. It's now a time of conflict, war, and also economic trouble, and all of the things just go on. So, I mean, as a Buddhist monk, my own practice and the practice I try to teach other people is very much about how to handle suffering and difficult times. And that's a universal thing. It's universal. I think we often say right now we're really going through hard times.
Yeah.
And then we say the next thing next year. And the Buddhist idea is that suffering is like a cycle that goes round and round and round, but there is a way out, which is to learn how to handle the suffering differently, because there's suffering and then there's our thoughts about suffering and how we relate to suffering. That's where the solution lies.
So I'm going to keep our listeners on tenterhooks for your wisdom around that just for a little longer. We always like to have a little bit of the Marvel superhero origin story on the podcast. In your case, actually, that's quite appropriate, isn't it? Because I think you taught Doctor Strange how to meditate.
Well, if I did help on that film, yes. Yeah. I teach the actors how to meditate.
But give us a little potted history, like how did Thubten become Thubten? I know that's a big question, but...
Yeah, so I've been a monk for 30 years now, and which is a long time. I mean, I was very young when I joined the monastery, and I really have to say, honestly, that I joined a monastery because I was in deep burnout. I suppose there was a sense of a spiritual search, spiritual seeking, but the most predominant feeling was I was just completely messed up, burned out.
Why were you like that?
I had gone through a time of, I was an actor. I was living in London, then New York. I was very much kind of on the run from my own mind, and because I was experiencing quite a lot of emotional turmoil, stress, anxiety, even panic attacks, periods of depression. And my way of dealing with that was just to be as ambitious as possible and also go to as many parties as possible. I became really like a party animal and lived a really unhealthy, excessive lifestyle. And the combination of all of that was just too toxic for me. And I had a full meltdown, literally one day to the next. I was in very severe burnout with a heart problem, atrial fibrillation, where your heart beats incredibly fast. And the doctors said to me, you've had a breakdown, a burnout breakdown. You need to look at your stress levels. And that's when I thought about meditation. And things just come together at the right time, right place. At that time, a really good friend of mine, one of my oldest friends, said to me, there's a Buddhist monastery in the borders of Scotland that just opened its doors for people who want to be a monk for the year. Because usually, although not in all Buddhist countries, but usually you become a monk for your whole life or nothing. I mean, it's such a jump. Whereas a year felt very doable. And I thought, well, it's like a retreat.
Yeah.
I'll go to this monastery, I'll be a monk, I'll kind of, really sort myself out and then go back to normal life. But that never happened because that year was so, it went so deep and I wanted to do more and practice more. So I ended up staying and extending my time as a monk year after year for about 3 or 4 years. And then I took lifelong vows.
Okay.
So I came to a point of feeling this is actually the life I'd like to live. Complete turnabout from the life I was living before. And yeah, that was all those years ago.
What was the, because I'd like to say we were slightly more enlightened these days. Like, back then that was would have been a major decision. Like, it wasn't a common thing for people to talk even about burnout. I mean, what was your reaction? Like, burnout? What's burnout?
Yeah, and actually when I started to give meditation classes in the, late 90s, when I started, a few years after being a monk, I started to give classes. And I would go into busy environments, hospitals, schools, offices. And I did find people were reluctant to be as expressive about their stress and their mental health as they are now. I mean, this is now 20 years later is a bigger conversation, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, in those days, the words burnout and stress, one felt a bit like a failure, whereas now actually everybody is going around saying, well, I am completely burned out all the time. It's the way we live. And so, yes, it was a different environment. And the other thing that was different was in those days, meditation wasn't so mainstream. Look, if you wanted to learn meditation, you had to go to not always, but generally to a Buddhist monastery, which for me is fine because I already had an interest in Buddhism and I come from a family that's always been into things like meditation and Eastern philosophy. Yeah. I myself am half Indian, half English.
Okay, yeah.
But for many other people, it would have been harder to find. So yeah, I would agree that the culture has changed now and conversation around mental health is more vocal and also accessibility to things like meditation is better.
It's fascinating that I'm talking to you today because I was at a press conference earlier today where Cigna have released this new data in their vitality. They do an annual survey every day. And interesting, even in a place like the UAE, which is one of the safest places on the planet right now, according to surveys, Abu Dhabi safest city in the world, according to a recent survey, Dubai number 4, lots of economic opportunity here. And actually in this vitality report, one of the leaders in the world around vitality. But then when you drill down, always on feeling, burnout, still high and higher than the global average here. In fact, one of the highest in the world. It feels like we can't get away from it. And you say like,
that's the paradox. It means that we now live in many areas of the world, we now live in the most materially comfortable situation we ever have lived in, and yet the most mentally uncomfortable. It's a strange paradox, isn't it? With the increase in material comfort, we haven't had a equal amount of increase in mental and emotional comfort. So stress levels are through the roof, levels of anxiety. And I think it's because with the consumer culture we inhabit, comes a lot of fear and a lot of feeling of dissatisfaction and needing more, wanting more all the time. And also, I think we're living in times culturally where we don't feel very good about ourselves.
no.
Even though we might be successful, we might be ambitious, we might be really achieving things, there's this kind of lack of self-worth that's really endemic now in our society.
That fascinates me. I was talking recently with someone, like, one of the reasons why I started Mentl as a business in the first place was I lost my father to depression and alcohol. And having had many conversations, it felt like his generation and my generation were the first generations that were actively sold to by TV and advertising, saying that big space, that big hole in your soul, material things will fill that. So all you need to do is work for the nicer car, work for the nicer house, and you will be complete. And then how many people, like my father, and even myself, get to that point and look around and going, oh, that was all a lie. And actually the hole is actually even bigger for all of this stuff, and not realizing, we've no idea, where do we go now?
And what we're not told is that the problem there is that the more we want, we want.
Yeah.
Wanting leads to more wanting. It's a habit.
Yeah.
So there's never an end. We get what we want, and then we realize, oh, that wasn't what I wanted. I want something else. And also at the same time as that, in order to sell us things, we have to be inundated with imagery and messaging that tells us you are not complete unless you have my product, unless you have buy this or buy that. So there's this kind of subtle erosion of our confidence all the time, telling us you're not enough, you're not good enough, you're not rich enough, you're not thin enough, you're not beautiful enough, whatever it is. And so with the endless wanting comes also endless feeling of incompleteness and dissatisfaction. So this is very prevalent now in the modern world. And yes, there are great things also about modern life. I mean, it is good that we have better healthcare and better comforts and all of that. But I think the time has come for people to really take time to look after their mental health as a matter of urgency now. And then, of course, it's possible to have physical comfort, but also internal happiness.
What's the prognosis? What's your view for our children? I'm the father of a 22-year-old boy, an 18-year-old boy, or 17 boy, and an 8-year-old girl. You know, and my generation, not to say that we're a lost cause, but I think we're only just beginning to wake up and go, oh God, this was all a bit of a lie. It feels like the millennials and the Gen Zs are maybe a few steps ahead of us in terms of recognizing that it's not just the pay packet that counts. But equally, I worry because they are marketed to do, as you say, 24/7, 25/8, as the kids would say, by evil geniuses and algorithms that are literally telling them all the time, you're not good enough, you're not good enough, you're not good enough. Where's the reckoning? Are things getting better? Are things getting harder? What do you see for the younger generations?
Well, it's a mixed bag, isn't it? Because yes, as you say, the next generation are even more embedded in that sort of endless messaging and brainwashing. It's going to make things feel even worse and worse. But traditional models of success have changed. The younger people are thinking outside the box in a way they never did. Ideas around who they are and what they want is much more fluid and expansive, and possibilities are there. And also people's willingness and ability to talk about mental health is very different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I teach meditation in schools, I often, I talk a lot to young children, teenagers, and they seem very self-aware. I've had groups of teenagers telling me, we know we're addicted to our phones. We know that social media is making us miserable. We also know that we need to look after ourselves better. So there is that openness, and they're very vocal about it. So that gives me hope.
Yeah.
And what, obviously in my work and the world I move around in, it's very much about meditation. And I do see how much more mainstream that's become. So it's much more accessible in many schools. It's kind of on the curriculum now. Doctors are talking about it as a stress intervention to their patients.
Yeah.
So while there's a growing problem, there's also the solution is more available. And that gives me a lot of hope. I feel quite positive about that. I don't feel pessimistic, really. I feel like anything's possible. And we're in a time when anything really is possible. More so than it ever used to be.
So the miserable people from my generation, the boomers, the Gen Xers, would look at the Gen Zs and call them snowflakes, would call them not resilient. Are you seeing that? And it's interesting because your book is, the guide to fearless living. What's the lessons for our younger people in terms of it? I mean, I think there's a lot of fear maybe they are vocalizing it more than my generation do. I think there's a lot of people my age who are terrified. They just can't talk about it. And unfortunately, they end up either drinking themselves to death or killing themselves, as we see by the statistics around the world. Whereas at least I feel the younger generations are a little bit more open about that fear.
In my book, I really wanted to write about fear as a subject and how much our culture is drenched in fear. And I looked at how much the way we receive information is laced with fear through the news, breaking news, and how we're sold things through fear. Hurry up while stocks last. You might not get
FOMO, I think we've got,
And so fear is politics. Politics is now so much around making people frightened rather than inspired. And so it is pretty horrible how fear invades every aspect of our lives. But from a meditation point of view, in a way, the bigger the problem, the more you can see it, and there's more to work with. And so fearless living, as I call it in the book, can really only come about through exploring the fear and understanding the nature of the beast so that you can start to transform the mind. And I think ultimately we're very frightened of our own minds. We're frightened of our own emotions. Do we pick up our phone? Do we go to another party? Do we get busy because we don't want to face ourselves? Is that what we're running away from? And meditation is a very gentle and accepting way to face yourself with love and compassion and acceptance.
Yeah, I've done some work on self-compassion. I went into therapy for that recently, and it was absolutely fascinating to see even how I talk to myself. In your book, which will be the culmination of, some of those lessons learned over the years practicing meditation, what are the first steps that people can begin to take? Or what are the pillars?
So I really encourage people to develop a daily habit of meditating, and I try to address why that seems to be such a struggle for many people. And I think people make it harder for themselves than it needs to be. Perhaps they think, it's not worth it unless I do hours and hours and hours of it a day. And, I'm a monk, and they might look at me as, it's all right for him. He lives in a monastery, he's done long retreats. He's got all the time in the world. But actually, I talk from where I'm at now, which is I'm busy. I write books, I give talks, I run centers. I'm busy. And I find I can definitely meditate every day, even with a busy schedule. And it is possible for anybody to do short moments, short sessions, maybe twice a day, a short session, but also little moments of meditation as you go through your day. So it's kind of that mindful experience starts to weave its way into your system and starts to really start to dissolve your fears. I think one of the main reasons people struggle with meditation is they don't know that it's okay to think. Do you know what I mean?
So much stimulation, and yet no time to sit in silence. And
well, we sit down in silence, and then maybe there's an assumption that we're supposed to clear our minds, silence our thoughts, and then we think we're a failure because we can't meditate. So that becomes a whole process.
I do remember the first time I tried, and it just made me more stressed and more anxious.
No, for a long time, I'd sit there meditating, thinking, shut this mind down. It wouldn't shut down. And I thought, well, I'm a failure at this, and I'd already become a monk, and it's too late to back out. What do? I can't shut this thing down. So I really had to change that attitude. Through the guidance of my teachers, they really explained to me that it's not about clearing the mind. It's about focusing the mind. It's about learning to come back to your breath again and again, or whatever the meditation practice is. But we've got to stop fighting our thoughts, because that in itself becomes a barrier to doing the meditation. Why would you want to fight your mind every day? It would be a nightmare. So of course you're not going to do it. But if you have a more gentle, accepting attitude towards the mind itself, meditation becomes easier and more possible.
So it does feel that we, not just our children, but, and I'm a former journalist. I call myself a recovering journalist. I look at a recovering journalist. We are kind of living in a world that's drenched in fear often. We're fed a daily diet of fear, as you say, through the particularly, I mean, I look back at the UK and the narrative and everything there is just like, oh my God. How do we begin to wean ourselves off that? I mean, in your book, what advice do you, well, without you giving away everything, how do we start weaning ourselves off that fear?
Well, in the book, I talk about an approach that seems at first counterintuitive, which is actually to lean into the fear. Lean into all your emotions, in fact, all of our painful, difficult emotions. We can actually learn to use them as part of meditation rather than trying to push them away or thinking that these are dreadful things and I need to get rid of them. To embrace them fully, it's almost like facing the thing you were running away from and it's not as bad as you thought.
Yes, yeah.
So I definitely worked with this a lot with anxiety when I was having long periods of terrible anxiety in a long retreat, which I write about in the book. I write about how I went into a 4-year-long retreat and it was just agony for a while with anxiety and panic. And it only started to change when I stopped trying to stop feeling anxious. And I thought, no, I'll just be with this anxiety. And there's obviously this part of me that is crying out for acceptance and compassion. And when you can use meditation to move closer to your pain, you start to explore how resistance and a desperate search for comfort and a fear of discomfort is actually what's creating the problem.
Because we're almost taught, there seems to be this common belief, and I am guilty of wanting this for my daughter, that nothing will ever be wrong. You know, there is no pain. Well, everything will always be fine, except it's not, and that's not reality.
And sort of trying to push ourselves into a state of fear. I have to be happy. Everything has to go well.
Yeah.
That's fear. That's fear, isn't it? I have to get everything right. I must make everything perfect. That creates so much tension. But what about being okay with what is? Now, at first, when you think about that, you might think, well, does that make you passive and sort of just not caring or putting up with misery? I don't mean just sort of becoming passively accepting of everything goes wrong. I mean actually learning to engage with the emotions that seem to torment us and to be okay with them, so that you are fearless in the face of a terrifying situation. Now, I'm not saying I can do that or anyone can just jump to that level. But what I do work with is moments throughout the day of kind of relaxing into discomfort, relaxing into emotions, into fear. And I definitely find that this is a very helpful approach in meditation, because sometimes we might think meditation is an escape. How do I make myself feel better?
Yeah.
Learning just to feel what you feel and be okay with that. That's much more powerful.
That's perhaps not the way that meditation's often advocated for.
Well, so my book, as a Buddhist monk, my books are always rooted in Buddhist philosophy, although I never kind of actively try and force Buddhism down people's throats. I try to write in a way that anybody can appreciate, that find something useful in it. And traditional Buddhist understanding of meditation is definitely about facing up to one's fears and not trying to always get comfortable, but learning to be more brave. And I would agree with you that maybe in the modern world, commercialization of meditation has maybe, for some people, not all, but for some people, has turned it into a kind of spa treatment.
Yes.
Feel-good exercise.
It's that placebo to...
There's a problem there, which is that if you sit down to meditate wanting to feel good, you're back to that same old problem of saying, I lack, I don't feel good. So the meditation starts to become quite dissatisfying. I know, because I've tried it like that. And I sat there trying to feel nice and just felt worse. And that's not a healthy approach.
So, for anyone that's struggling out there right now, what would be the 3 things you would say do? You know, we say the stop, start, and repeat type thing. Even from your own experiences, what were the things that you needed to stop?
Need to stop? I think it's very much about and this is not a one-off thing, but it's an ever-evolving process, about giving up or letting go of our fight with our own mind, our feeling of, I want these difficult feelings to go away, because the more you push them away, the bigger they grow.
Yeah.
So I think we need to find ways to stop pushing everything away and just relax with it. Now, that sounds scary and kind of impossible, but if you give yourself a daily dose of meditation, you're arming yourself for hard times. You're preparing yourself. You're giving yourself a medicine that will help you in.
Fascinating to see how the conversation has changed as well over, I mean, you've been a monk now, you say, for 13 years. You know, how it's been, I mean, sometimes it's still described as a little bit woo-woo, but from the clinical community, you know, once completely and utterly dismissed, and now being prescribed.
Absolutely, and the scientific research into meditation has made it very, people have more confidence now because they've seen the scan results. You know, you can scan somebody's brain after they've done some meditation, you'll see a difference. Maybe not in one day, but after they've done it for a few weeks or even actually a few days, there will be a difference in the scanner. So the evidence is stacking up in a positive way. And I think that has elevated people's view of meditation from being kind of alternative fringe activity to being a serious medical intervention that we all need. We know we should exercise. We know we should eat nutritious food. So
we're also seeing the clinical damage done by stress.
Yes, and we know that there is something out there called meditation that has been clinically, scientifically proved to help reduce stress and give us a better relationship with our emotions. So I think that scientific backing has really helped put meditation more on the map.
May I ask, because at Mental we talk to the entire community, but one sort of demographic that I'm sort of super worried about at the minute is men in the world right now. And we do seem to have, you know, a huge problem. 70% of all suicides last year were men. I think, you know, lots of guys getting to my stage of life, you know, the mid-40s, the 50s, and not being able to cope with all of the pressures, the responsibilities, but not being able to talk to others, but probably, the most difficult thing is not being able to talk to themselves. What's your advice, thoughts on that situation in terms of, you know, men being able to start a conversation with themselves and ask themselves and check in with themselves on how they're doing?
Well, I sort of keep banging the same drum, which is meditation. But
yeah,
I think if everybody can bring a practice like meditation into their lives, or if they don't feel ready to meditate or they don't want to, there are other things, that talking therapies, anything where you sort of are willing to engage with your inner world, maybe with the help of a therapist, that could be helpful too. The whole idea is that you're willing to engage with that inner world. And in your research, do you find that, I mean, it's hard to kind of generalize, isn't it? But do you find that men traditionally have a harder time expressing how they feel?
Yes.
And sort of macho image, but is that also dissolving now? Culturally, isn't the culture moving in a way where this sort of traditional ideas of masculinity and femininity are all up for question now?
Unfortunately, I think again, if we talk about the boomers and the Gen Xers in particular, I mean, I know, as we've said before, like my sons are having a better conversation about mental health. I think they are more cognizant of it.
It's safer to talk about it now.
It's safer to talk about it.
It feels safe because it's in the culture as a conversation.
But now we have guys who are sort of my age in leadership positions. They have mortgages. They have, you know, school fees.
It's really scary to admit that you're struggling, because you've got people depending on you to at least look like you're not struggling.
Yes.
And that's hard.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
That asking for help is not a weakness thing, I think, is yet to click in many men of my generation, particularly.
So one thing about meditation, especially in a kind of corporate setting, business setting, is that people often start using meditation because they understand it will improve their mental performance, improve their focus, their productivity. So in a way, they're kind of walking into the meditation world through a very particular door. But then once they're in that world, they all start to go deeper. I mean, look at me. I became a monk because I was having a nervous breakdown. So I can't say, I was genuinely, full-heartedly, spiritually seeking. I was just desperate. But then my interest in Buddhist philosophy started to grow, and my reasons for being a monk started to change. So the same with people's entry into meditation. It could be more like a sport or a kind of like going to the gym for the brain. And that some men might appreciate that approach.
Frame it in that performance,
might find it
enhanced.
Successful in that way. But then once they're in the door, they'll start to look at their emotions and start to find ways to work with the mind at a deeper level.
So if I'm going to, because you've been very generous with your time, if I'm going to, let's say, draw a reference from a Marvel movie in Doctor Strange, if you were able to, forgive the pun, astrally project yourself back to your younger self before you became that monk, is that whole question of what would you have thought of your younger self, or what would you have said to that younger self?
I think I needed somebody to tell me that that there is a possibility, there's a window of opportunity always present to choose to feel differently. I didn't know that you can work with the mind. I thought, well, this is how I am. I'm miserable, I'm upset, I'm unhappy. And I think the problem was I was blaming that on the outside world all the time. It's because of him or her or this or that. If somebody could have just told me, you have a mind that has the potential to transform, everything you want is within you, it would have been so life-changing. It was, because I went to a monastery and that's what they told me. But maybe if I'd heard it earlier. But then I'm glad I went through hell, because going through hell teaches you a lot.
That feels like the mic drop of mic drop moments. Thubten, it's been a genuine pleasure to meet you and to talk to you today. If our listeners are tuning in and they want to know, where do they pick up your book? Amazon? Is it where?
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the place. Yes, and I've got 2 books. I've got this one, Handbook for Hard Times, and then a book I wrote 4 years ago called A Monk's Guide to Happiness. Okay. And they sort of go together. In fact, I'm writing a 3rd one now, so it'll be a trilogy.
Trilogy, yeah.
Guide trilogy. But
the Monk Strikes Back.
And in these books, I try to present the kind of philosophy and ideas, but also practical tools. So exercises, because you've got to give people tools they can use.
Yeah.
So the books have loads of meditation exercises.
So give our listeners, give our watchers one tool at least that you'd say that's the go there.
Oh, micro moments, because I think everybody knows it's good to sit down and meditate and want to kind of clear their schedule and do 10 or 15 minutes a day or whatever. But maybe what they don't know is that it's also hugely important and helpful to practice tiny, tiny moments of mindful awareness, even in a busy day. As you're walking down a street, as you're doing things, as you're sitting behind your desk, just feeling the ground under your feet, being aware of the chair under your body, brushing your teeth mindfully, washing your hands mindfully, you start to see that actually that meditation, the benefits of meditation are always available to you, even in the middle of busiest situations. Imagine.
I could talk to you for hours, but I'm afraid our micro moments are up. If you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, please remember that you can subscribe to The Mental Space. If you're watching on YouTube, please click subscribe. And we are on all the podcast channels, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcast, and many more. Once more, Gelong Thubten, thank you so much for joining us on the Mental Space podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Genuinely enjoyed that.